Defeated and depleted of military technology after World War I, Germany adopted the highly controversial Plan Z in 1939. Launched shortly before the start of World War II, the project could have made Hitler's naval power equal to that of the United Kingdom's Royal Navy, and it called for the construction of 10 battleships, 3 battlecruisers, 4 carriers, 15 Panzerschiffe, 5 heavy and 13 light cruisers, 22 scouts, 68 destroyers, and 90 U-boats, for a total of 230 vessels with over 200,000 sailors. Facing a formidable threat from such a surface fleet available may have caused Britain to think twice about their island nation's vulnerability, and may have put Germany on the front foot for any sea lion-like amphibious invasion across the English Channel. Strangled by the Treaty of Versailles. The imposition of harsh sanctions stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I included limitations for the Reichsmarine to own only 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats, most of which were either reconstructions of ships lost to the war or based on outdated designs. The treaty allowed Germany to keep an additional 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 2 outdated battleships, and 1 torpedo boat of each type in reserve. Of these, the first light cruiser and major component of the German Navy to be built was the Emden in the 1920s. 3 additional Königsberg-class light cruisers were built soon after, and were followed by the updated Königsberg ships Leipzig and Nuremberg. In order to get around limitations of the treaty, the Germans created a private company to serve as a front for submarine development based in the Netherlands called NV Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw. Through the front company, Germany made submarines for Turkey and Finland, which served as early versions of the eventual German U-boats used throughout the Second World War. Beginning in February of 1922, the navies of the UK, US, France, Italy, and Japan were also beholden to their own limitations, although far more permissive, through the Washington Naval Treaty, or Five Powers Treaty, which tried to preemptively halt a naval arms race. Germany sought to be included in the treaty in order to position itself in the global military picture once more, and as a way of reducing the harshness of the limitations to which it was subjected. In order to pressure the treaty members, it built the first Panzerschiffe, a heavily armed cruiser still within the stipulations of Versailles, that nonetheless outpowered the new British and French heavy cruisers. Those new heavy cruisers were supposed to be limited by a maximum 10,000-ton displacement imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty and the 1930 Treaty for the Limitation and Reduction of Naval Armament, but the Deutschland Panzerschiffe utilized new lightweight welding techniques and invested the difference in 6 11-inch guns. By showing that they could potentially overpower the Allies, Germany hoped the Treaty of Versailles would be considered deficient in that regard and replaced by admission into the Washington Naval Treaty. The move did not pan out as intended, however, as France strongly opposed to any concessions of the original post-war treaty. Germany continued taunting the other powers by building 2 more Panzerschiffe, the Admiral Scheer and the Admiral Graf Spee. By 1932, the Reichstag passed the Schiffbauersatzplan for the Reichsmarine, a bill seeking to rebuild the German Navy in 2 phases, from 1930 to 1936, and then from 1936 to 1943, with the second phase meant to break away from the restrictions imposed by Versailles. At the end of that year, Hitler's party remained the Reichstag's largest, with 33% of the seats. In February of 1933, the Reichstag building was burnt down under suspicious circumstances 4 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Under the guise of responding to the perceived threat to the government, Hitler passed the Enabling Act at the end of March, granting him the power to act without consent from the legislative body through emergency powers. That same month, the soon-to-be dictator announced the country's unilateral abandonment of the Treaty of Versailles' naval limitations, which had kept the German Navy at 1/3 the size of the Royal Navy when at full capacity. On June 18, 1935, the United Kingdom reached an agreement with Germany, letting the country build up to 35% of the British total naval tonnage and 45% of its submarine tonnage, a bilateral agreement that served as an active, albeit unspoken, consent to letting Germany rearm its navy. France was against the concession and prudently worried of the danger that a rearmed Germany could pose. The move distanced France and Britain. A plan. Starting in the mid-1930s, the new government of Germany commenced planning the details to the restoration of Germany's naval power. Vice Admiral Erich Raeder took over the Reichsmarine in 1928, and along with his appointment came new goals. He endorsed the idea of building long-range surface raiders, like those of the Royal Navy, which defeated Germany's navy during the First World War. The prospect of war with Britain was an increasing possibility by 1938 due to Germany's aggressive foreign policy, but at the time Hitler believed, and thereby assured Raeder, that war would not commence until at least 1948. In September of 1938, a naval committee was assembled to assess the state of Germany's navy and recommend strategies for increased ship construction. Hitler ordered the battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz to be completed quickly, along with 6 H-class battleships. He estimated that the 8 ships would be the main component of the Navy's new forces. Raeder favored a surface raider strategy, so his original Plan X focused on long-range cruisers, the Panzerschiffe, and U-boats to disrupt British commerce. He revised his plan as Plan Y, and after more careful consideration of the Führer's goals, composed Plan Z. Hitler amended the construction proposal and accepted it on March 1, 1939, only months away from the start of the war. The final proposal called for the construction of 10 battleships, 3 battlecruisers, 4 carriers, 15 Panzerschiffe, 5 heavy and 13 light cruisers, 22 scouts, 68 destroyers, and 90 U-boats for a total of 230 vessels. These numbers included the Bismarck and Tirpitz, as well as 4 Scharnhorst battleships already completed or in process, and 3 Panzerschiffe in service at the time. Not only was the plan intended to strengthen Germany's position, but to approach the limits stipulated by the Washington Naval Treaty, which Hitler's regime still partially hoped it could be integrated into. The plan was intended to have the majority of the ships completed by 1945, and to have all the fleet supplied by 1948, under the stipulation that an armed conflict didn't interrupt the construction process. Interrupted execution. The first steps of the project, aside from finishing what was already in process, were the light battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which featured 9 guns and provided German naval shipbuilders with experience building vessels of that type. The skills developed in this phase were expected to come in handy when working on the construction of larger ships. As for the 6 H-class battleships meant to be at the forefront of the German naval battle fleet, production was delayed on multiple occasions due to design changes, which were settled by 1939. Had these been completed, the 6 ships, sort of enlarged Bismarck-class vessels, would have carried 8 16-inch guns, making them a formidable adversary for the most advanced American and British battleships, although construction would have probably taken longer than planned due to a lack of German design and engineering experience. Unfortunately for the Germans, Plan Z was doomed to fail as soon as World War II began. None of the H ships were ever completed, even though the first 2 ships were laid down, and the initial plan was scrapped in November of 1941 so that the metal could be used for supporting more immediate war efforts. The contracts for all 6 of the H-class ships had been awarded, but no work was started on the other 4 before Plan Z's cancellation. The Bismarck and Tirpitz were the only real ships to be completed, as the Kriegsmarine shifted its focus almost exclusively to developing U-boats, which promised a faster and more successful way of disrupting the commercial operations of the Allied powers. Hitler's government eschewed Plan Z, which would have challenged the Royal Navy if carried out, but would still have lagged behind the American Navy. Only 82 of the 230 ships intended to form the German Navy were ever integrated into it, among them mostly the original ships. The U-boat fleet reached the 300 peak intended to defeat Britain by 1943. By then, the combined power of the Allies made this prospect unrealistic, and the Germans were in the process of losing the war. Battle of the Barents Sea. Perhaps the single most decisive moment that affected the small progress that Plan Z had made was the Battle of the Barents Sea on December 31, 1942. It was then that Hitler ordered a raid through the Kriegsmarine on the British-escorted convoy WW2, which was taking war materials to the USSR through the Kola Inlet. The transported goods included over 200 tanks, more than 200 vehicles, 120 aircraft, fuel and aviation fuel, among other supplies. The merchant ships were protected by 6 British destroyers, as well as 2 small warships, in addition to 2 trawlers and a minesweeper. The Kriegsmarine sent its heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and the Panzerschiffe Deutschland, along with 6 destroyers. The battle happened in the midst of a polar night with little visibility. The Germans lost a destroyer, and the Deutschland was damaged. The British, on the other hand, lost a destroyer and the minesweeper, and all the merchant vessels arrived at the Soviet Union unharmed. Blaming the mission's failure to destroy the convoy and the surface ships, Hitler ordered the remaining German warships to be broken up for scrap metal. Raeder resigned in protest and was replaced by former U-boat officer Karl Dönitz, who managed to calm the Führer down. The Deutschland was moved to Altafjord for repairs, where it remained until it was sent to Norway in September of 1943 and then to Kiel again for repairs. It was finally sunk at Kaiserfahrt by RAF Lancaster bombers. While Dönitz managed to convince Hitler not to scrap the fleet, the vessels were largely ignored in operational planning. Admiral Hipper and the light cruisers Emden and Leipzig sat unused until late 1944. The battleship Gneisenau was left unrestored. The only subsequent surface operation carried out by the Germans was a failed raid on another convoy by the capital ship Scharnhorst, sunk by the British. Hitler's attention instead turned towards the construction of U-boats, leaving one to wonder what such a goal could have accomplished if pursued from the very beginning. In his book German Warships 1815 to 1945, Erich Groener estimated that over 100 U-boats could have been completed with the amount spent on Plan Z, leaving Germany much better prepared for a submarine warfare strategy by the start of the war. Instead, by the time U-boats became a definitive focal point in 1943, the naval campaign was already lost. What if? It's thought that the cancelled Plan Z would probably not have been able to halt the progress of the Allied powers united against the Third Reich if it had been executed sooner, but might have given the Germans a greater fighting chance by tying up the British fleet and providing a more believable invasion threat to keep more British resources at home. Yet even then, by the planned completion date in 1948, the British Royal Navy would have also made progress on additional ships that would have likely outpowered the Germans. Even with Japanese and Italian support, the Third Reich would have struggled to battle the United Kingdom. Furthermore, the American Two-Ocean Navy Act passed by Congress in 1940, which called for the greatest historical naval procurement bill in the United States, had the goal of growing the United States Navy by 70%. Under the bill, the United States would have easily overpowered the intended vessels of Plan Z. Along the same lines, Soviet efforts to expand their navy would have posed an additional threat had the war been delayed. While bold and terrifying, most experts agree that the completion of Plan Z would have not changed the landscape of naval warfare enough to put Germany in a victorious position.